Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Weber. I am happy to announce that I will be presenting on adapted physical activity. This lecture will talk about what exactly adapted physical activity is. We're going to go over the table of contents in a little bit, but first I'll talk about who I am. I am Dr. Jordan Weber. I'm a senior lecturer in healthful living and fitness education at UNCW. In 2020, I got the NC Shape Adapted Physical Educator College University Professor of the Year Award. I have been teaching people with disabilities at UNCW since 2010 as a peer mentor when I started, to an adjunct faculty, to part-time faculty, to full-time faculty, to lecturer, to senior lecturer. My goal eventually is to be assistant professor. I've been researching and just got published in the Journal of Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance not too long ago. I've taught over 30 presentations in a variety of pedagogy and related to fitness, wellness, and sports. And I've had 2 published articles and 3 major grants. And I've been at UNCW as a student since 2010. I earned my doctorate degree from UNCW as well in 2018, and my dissertation was on adapted fitness for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, where we took individuals with disabilities and we had them teach other students with disabilities in a 501c3 nonprofit. So the objectives for this video, this class, this lecture is to learn about adapted physical activity in sport, physical education, special education, inclusion, social inclusion, those types of things, how to break down the barriers working with people with disabilities in the health and fitness field. We're going to talk about laws and historical facts about people with disabilities. We're going to discuss the continuum and placements where people with disabilities are taught. We're going to talk about the negative experiences that people with disabilities have had, and then we'll talk about their counterparts and people without disabilities on their experiences with people with disabilities in physical education. And then we'll talk about how to increase inclusion, general ideas to get you started in adapted physical activity. So the table of contents for this lecture series, there's 10 total lectures. This is lecture 1. We're going to talk about what is adapted physical activity, an overview, an introduction. Then the next lecture is going to go into the why, or the research in adapted physical education. And we're going to talk about when it comes to the categories of disability, so autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, those types of things. Then we're going to talk about IEP plans, how to create objectives and goals. We'll talk about assessments, and then we'll get into lesson planning and then effective instruction for people with disabilities. So hopefully you can learn a lot in this 10-part lecture series. So as far as the learning objectives, we've talked about that. We're going to first start talking about the historical perspectives and the research when it comes to what did they do for people with disabilities? How did they treat them? So it's not until the 1960s and the Civil Acts law that went into agreement that people of disability, race, gender was supposedly supposed to break down those barriers, giving them entry into the public society. Because before the civil rights movement, people with disabilities were institutionalized or medicated and isolated. And before this, let's just go back 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, medieval times, people with disabilities were looked at as bad omens, and their families would isolate them. Society would outcast them. If you had a brother or a sibling with a disability, people would think that you were evil or they were evil. So it was typically a bad omen. And then long before this, thousands of years ago, you talk about Roman era, Greek era, all these eras, Egyptian era, people with disabilities may have been left to die. and out in the wilderness. If there was a defect of a baby, or if they noticed something was different or off, they might just leave them behind because it was survival of the fittest. So if you had a mental disability, a social disability, or a physical disability, you might set the tribe or group back. And so a lot of times, many thousands of years ago, if people with disabilities were in the community, they might not only be isolated, but just left to die. So when you look at the research, it's very harsh up until, I'd say, 100 years ago, when people were starting to understand people with disabilities, understand that they needed to be treated effectively and that they were human. And I think a lot of it before this was that they were dehumanized before this. So the biggest laws that you should know about people with disabilities are ADA, IDEA, Section 504. These three laws are the most important laws for adapted physical educators. Why? Because Americans Disabilities Act was a big achievement when it came to access for people with disabilities. So let's just say you go to a movie theater, and there needs to be a ramp to the movie theater, right? So that's the ADA. You go to the mall, there needs to be an elevator if there's a second floor. That's ADA. IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, this came to play in 1975 and was reenacted in 1990. And this basically gives free and appropriate special education to people with disabilities, which includes physical education. So by law, IDEA, which is mandated by the federal government, says that all people with disabilities should get physical education and special education and free and appropriate services, including in the least restrictive environment, which basically means we have to teach them in the most restrictive environment to help them with their motor skills and health. Okay, so what are the best avenues? And we'll talk about placements in a little bit. Then we talk about Section 504. So this law basically helps them when it comes to transitional services, getting out into the community and having programs for people with disabilities. Special Olympics is a good example of how Section 504 has helped people with disabilities go from youth to adult and have services that also align for people with disabilities. This means that we need to have jobs for people with disabilities. This is going to relate to all the transitional services for people with disabilities. So Section 504, IDEA, and ADA are all three super important laws that you have to know as an adaptive physical educator or a person that has an individual with disability in their class. So I have a link here on laws if you want to go through that. What is adapted physical activity? Basically, it's an umbrella term, okay? It's going to encompass things like adapted physical education, which we're going to focus on, adapted sport, so for Paralympics, and it could also be Special Olympics, recreational activities for people with disabilities. So any activity that's adapted for people. It could be for people that are very old and are like something like seated yoga. So that would be a form of adapted physical activity. Any form of activity that is adapted or modified for people with disabilities or who have impairments in either social, mental, or physical ailments. First, where does adaptive physical education or activity come from when it comes to teaching it in the K through 12 setting? It comes from physical education. So basically, as a physical educator, you have to not only teach people with disabilities, but you have to teach people without disabilities. As a physical educator, you have to teach physical and motor skills, fundamental motor skills and patterns, motor fitness, skills in aquatics, dance, individual group games, sports, including lifetime sports. And now we're emphasizing more fitness related goals because we've emphasized so much sport and competition. We're going toward more of a lifetime fitness pathway for especially those high school students. So learning those fundamental movement skills like locomotor pathways, throwing, catching, swinging a bat in elementary, and then middle and high school, teaching them about sports and fitness, but how they can do it over a lifetime. So that's what physical education is. People with disabilities get free special education that includes physical education. They should be going to a general PE class if they have a disability that doesn't limit their behavior or motor skills. So you might have a social disability, but that shouldn't limit you from going to general PE class. If you have a physical disability, you may need adaptive physical education, but we'll talk about the placements in adaptive physical education in a little bit. Adapted physical education. So what is it? It's individualized programs of physical and motor fitness, fundamental motor skills and patterns, skills in aquatic stance, individual and group games and sport that are designed to meet the unique needs of individuals. So we'll talk about who those individuals are in lecture number 3. Special education is a specially designed instruction at no cost to parents with unique needs of child with disability, including instruction conducted in the classroom, in the home, hospitals, institutions, and other settings, and in physical education. So listen, physical education is the only subject that is in that definition of special education. So as educators, we have to understand that it is in the law, but it's not only in the law, but it's in the definition of special education. The least restrictive environment. So what is the best educational scenario for this student? This is the least restrictive environment, and this is the continuum and placements that individuals with disabilities will experience throughout a lifetime. So if you have a mild disability, you might not need any supplement aids. You might not need any paraeducators to help you. You might not need a special class. You might not need to go in a special school. You may just be with your peers. So things that it depends on, it could depend on the severity of the disability. Sometimes it deals with the schedule. So what is the best schedule for this student? So sometimes you have to figure out the best schedule that would give them the most success. What are their support services? What are the age appropriateness of the activities? Do we need to change those? What type of assessments do we need for the individual? What type of setting should they be placed in? Do they need an assistant paraeducator or a general PE teacher, or do they need an adapted physical educator? So let's talk about the most restrictive to the least restrictive environments for people with disabilities. So probably the most restrictive environment would be the hospital or treatment center, right? And then the least restrictive would be the general class placement. And so we restrict them, or we progress them throughout this placement and continuum. And what this will do will progress over time, right? So let's just say you, as a general PE teacher, you're gonna work with the special educator, the adaptive physical educator. You may work with a physical therapist, occupational therapist, a verbal specialist, maybe it's an auditory specialist. You might be working with a collaborative group of people when you're working on their individual education plan. And what you'll do is you'll decide where do you think they need to be as far as continuum and placement. Should they be in a full-time special class, or should it be just part-time? Should they be in the general class with supplementary aids like visual guides, or do they need a personal assistant like a peer or a paraeducator? Or do they just go in a general class placement? So the continuum of possibilities for adaptive physical education services, basically we go from hospitals to special schools to full-time individual classes to part-time individual classes to full-time special ed classes to peers with disabilities that participate, then part-time special ed classes, then part-time gen ed classes, then gen ed classes with assistance, then full-time gen ed classes without any assistance. So the continuum of possibilities: level 1, you're in general PE. Level 2, you're in general PE with an adapted physical educator consultation. Level 3, you're an adapted physical educator direct services in general PE. So the adaptive physical educator works with a general PE teacher in creating the program, or it's a self-contained program with an adapted physical educator in level 4. So those would be the continuum of possibilities. What is inclusion? How do we include people with disabilities in physical education when they're in our general PE class? And how do we do this maybe at our fitness centers as well? So educating people with disabilities in regular education settings along with students without disabilities, bring along with them supplementary aids and service they require. So basically, it's educating students with disabilities in regular settings along with students without disabilities. And then we're giving them supplementary aids and services that they require to help include them in the class. What are the benefits of inclusion? Why would we do this? Well, it offers a more stimulating and motivating environment, enhances the development of social and play skills, it promotes friendship among students with and without disabilities, and provides skill role models that is desperately needed for people with disabilities who may spend a lot of time with their peers who have disabilities, and they need to find outlets and places in society where they can feel included, and general PE is one of the best places we can do this. Choosing the right framework to teach adapted physical education. Basically, when you are designing your curriculum, you want to have a theoretical framework. What's the overall arching goal? And this would be the universal design for learning. The universal design for learning suggests that instruction should be designed with all learners in mind from the very beginning. So once you get that class role, once you understand who your students are, you need to then design lesson plans around everybody. You don't just go into a semester saying, this is how I teach, this is what I teach, and this is how I'm going to teach it. No, you have to say, who are my students? What are their needs? How can I make sure everyone's included? And then how can I make it fun and motivating for even the higher learners? This is not an easy task. That's why a lot of people don't want to do this, in my opinion. They don't want to have to make all these decisions and extra planning, and a lot goes into this, okay? But the best teachers will do this, okay? The principles of UDL apply to all facets of education, including architectural considerations, materials and implements, instructional approaches, and assessment. All learners are equally valued and must be considered from the very beginning. Barriers from people who are less supportive. So you're going to have the naysayers, or you're going to just have people that say that there's going to be disruptions in the class, which means that you're going to get less attention from the teacher, general PE students, or there'll be less time on task because you'll have to help other students with disabilities. Then you're going to have teachers that are inadequately prepared, who don't know how to plan for people with disabilities. You're going to have lack of interest and motivation by some teachers, so you might have that as a barrier. Students without disabilities may feel held back if you do too many things that are at low skill, or what they seem or deem or perceive to be low skill, so they might not feel like they're challenged enough. So how do you teach skills where you can challenge everyone all at the same time? It can be expensive. Adapted equipment is probably the most expensive equipment I've had to purchase. And I've had grants and I've had to purchase equipment. And I'll tell you, adapted equipment is probably the most expensive. Needs administrative understanding and approval. So another barrier could be administration. They might not allocate the funds for your program because they don't see it as necessary, or they have to make budget cuts and maybe you're the first to go. But if they understand how important adaptive physical education is, and that it is the law, and they have your approvals, then it's going to be very important and beneficial and meaningful for your students. What are the key functions of successful inclusion? Well, first, identifying unique needs. So you have to assess the individual where they're at. If they have a physical disability, you may need to alter the assessment for them. You may find a suitable assessment that is directly correlated to their disability, which there are many and plentiful assessments. You want to determine appropriate instructional settings and support services. You want to have individualized instruction, so making sure that you're changing the way you speak or tone. Maybe it's a different motivational technique for this individual, or external cue that might be different, or maybe you're using tactile cues, physical touch, to get them to be able to do the right thing, or hand over hand with their permission, of course. Adapting activities, so modifying them, making them easier, making them more challenging, or making them more motivating to perform the activity. You want to prepare your general education students, and we'll talk more about how to prepare other students for people with disabilities, because you don't want to just throw someone in with a disability with people without disabilities without them knowing that there may be some differences in your instructional style, or there may be some different things that we do that are more inclusive that we wouldn't typically do, because it may be before this teacher didn't teach inclusive practices and now they need to kind of dim down their competitiveness and they have to make things more cooperative. So you have to prepare students for this change if you haven't done it before, or your staff or the people that are in the facility. And then you want to prepare support personnel like the peer tutors, the paraeducators, the assistants, the volunteers. If they don't feel supported, they're just going to want to observe and sit on the outsides and be on their phone. So if they don't have anything to do, if they don't know what to do or how to do it, then you're not going to have as much success. What are some supplementary aids that foster inclusion? Well, special equipment, we've talked about that. There's special instruction, so there's different ways to instruct, and we'll talk about effective ways in our last video in this series. Special peer grouping, so making sure you're partnering maybe the leaders in your class with people with disabilities, because they're going to get more bang for their buck there. You might not want to, maybe there's certain people you don't want to partner up because you don't think there's going to be a good communication pathway. So making sure that you're working with the right peer groups, personnel, peer tutors, and teacher assistants, and then individualized programs that are specific for their needs. What are the voices of students with disabilities when it comes to physical education, adaptive physical education, and fitness? So here's one voice. I participated in PE once, but I was just a line judge. I just sat there and cheered on and did all that. I just sat and watched them and clapped and stuff. So this is 3 different experiences, all the same scenario where they're just sitting and watching, observing, and maybe being a line judge or clapping. So this is not inclusion. This is being excluded from the game. This is not how you teach inclusion. So if they are not involved in the game, what are some activities and skills you can teach that get everyone involved at the same time? Maybe that's just teaching the skill theme approach, which we'll talk about when we get into lesson planning. And we'll talk about how to progress exercises and activities so that everyone can be stimulated all at the same time. My teacher that I had then didn't have anything for me to do. I'd sit up on stage when I got there until the end of class. I felt different, like there was something wrong with me at first, but then I realized that it was just the way some people are, and that was how I was too, and I had to live with it basically. So self-realization that you are excluded, that you are not included in physical education, and voices with disabilities, people with disabilities, say more about how we perceive them than it does why we should teach them these skills. So more voices. My freshman year, I had to take 1 year of PE in order to graduate, and I pretty much showed up the first day. The instructor told me to leave because I was a liability. So I sat in the library for an hour every day, like having a study hall, and I got an A in PE. Okay, so not included. You might not, because of this, maybe they'll not be fit for their lifetime. Maybe they won't ever participate in sport. Maybe they'll back away from going to the gym. So you're basically could be detrimenting the health of an individual who is already have marginalized health. And we'll talk about that when we get into research. When asked if he liked physical education, well, not that much, because about every time I get embarrassed because I can't walk well, I can't run well, I can't do volleyball that well, I can't do any kind of sport that well, this here PE class, I always get embarrassed. So let's just say this individual may have crutches, may have cerebral palsy that limits their locomotor skills. As a PE teacher, you got to limit those locomotor skills and do things like manipulative skills, something like hockey. Maybe it's a target game like bowling or bocce, something that everyone can do and still have the same skill set at. That would be inclusion. Or if you are doing running drills, make sure you have some battle rope. Maybe you have an upper body station for this individual and other individuals, so they're not just feeling left out. Okay, so these are the voices of people with disabilities. This is how they feel in general PE class. So that's maybe why they don't do that well in general PE, and this is maybe why general PE teachers have a negative viewpoint toward people with disabilities and people with lower skills in general. So what are some problems facing social inclusion? Placing children with disabilities in the general PE done poorly can lead to feelings such as, why is he in my class? Why is she making all those weird noises? Why does he get to run around and not follow directions? Why does she have to be on my team? And he will ruin the game for everyone. These are real quotes from students without disabilities that are problems facing social inclusion. Because if you have a negative viewpoint towards someone with a disability, you're less likely to include them in your social group or in a game that you're playing in recess or out when you're at the beach and you're playing a game of pickup soccer and you see someone with a disability and you don't want to include them. Okay, why, I don't want them on my team, they're going to ruin the game. That why don't they get to follow the rules? Well, they don't understand why, in the first place. This is why the general PE teacher has to make sure that they prepare the students in the class, that they have to overhaul their program. They can't just go about their competitive ways. They can't go about how they were teaching in the past. So if you're going to teach a truly inclusive program, you have to overhaul that curriculum. So preparing people for social inclusion. So what do we do? What do we say to these people that are about to embark and work or directly interact with people with disabilities? How do we prepare for social inclusion? Well, have a guest speaker with a disability come in and tell the students about their disability and tell them what their life was growing up with a disability and tell them what their social life has been like. Um, Maybe have your students do some role playing. Maybe it's a visual impairment. Maybe you have to do a physical impairment role play. Discuss the concepts of rules and handicapping. So giving people advantages to make it fair. That's why we do that in golf, that sort of thing. Lead a discussion on disabilities. So talk to them about disabilities in general. Talk about famous people that have disabilities. Maybe you're talking about the specific individual. Maybe it is someone that makes sounds, and it might be sounds that are, maybe something that a student has never heard before. Maybe they just have a repetitive or restricted behavior. Maybe they have Tourette syndrome. And so you have to teach your students about these behaviors before they come to your class. Explain how to interact with specific children. So tell them maybe, they have autism spectrum disorder, so they might not be able to understand your, maybe some of your snarkiness or kind of your, your fake, if you're just kind of, just fooling around, they might not understand that. Provide an ongoing information and encouragement for these individuals. So, tell them, giving them information about disabilities, giving them encouragement. Be like, you're doing a really good job with it, Jimmy. I see that you're really trying. Maybe try this, maybe try this. So you're giving them advice. How do you facilitate this? One, you have to have a positive attitude. You cannot have a negative attitude. When it comes to being the leader of a group of people, it's always about positivity first. You want to be the teacher for all students in your general education class. So you want to make sure that, you're both the general PE teacher, or you're also the teacher for people with disabilities. You want to model appropriate behavior. You want to include the child in as many activities as possible. You want to reinforce positive interactions, and you want to be knowledgeable about the child. So these are all ways we can facilitate social inclusion. Except for maybe that second one. That one didn't really make any sense. Barriers to social inclusion. Attitudes of peers without disabilities. So the attitudes of peers without disabilities, if we can lift those attitudes, or if we can give them some understanding or empathy, compassion, these types of words, and talk to them about these words, not sympathy, not pity, compare these words, talk about these words, what these words mean. Put yourself in their shoes. How would it feel? Ask them the question, and have a group conversation. Your general PE teachers might be a barrier to social inclusion. They might not know how to include. They might not know what to do. They might not want to do it. Paraprofessionals, they might not be a good help. They could be a barrier to social inclusion. They might not understand the individual that well, so they have to be educated on the individual. They have to understand why PE is important for people with disabilities. They have to understand it's the law. They can't just sit on their phones. And the attitudes of administrators, that could be a barrier to social inclusion, because if you don't have the funding and you don't have the backup or the support, you're not going to get any inclusion done at your school or at your fitness facility. So preparing people for inclusion, provide them with information regarding what their role is, Provide them information regarding your philosophy. So my philosophy would be UDL, just making sure that you are planning for everyone at every time. Provide resources and key personnel who they can go to if they need help. Provide detailed description of the student. We've talked about that. Any specific information about safety procedures, emergency procedures. So what do you do in case of a seizure? Someone has epilepsy. People with disabilities may have epilepsy, and they're going to be at a higher risk for other um, things like that. So you got to be prepared um, for anything. And you have to have information on what typically happens in your class or your fitness center, or your physical education setting. So, what is the routine? You want to have suggestions on how to modify activities. So, always kind of giving each person specific modifications for their specific disability. So, knowing everyone enough to know that they're all going to get different cues, they're all going to get different motivational techniques, they're all going to need different maybe attitudes when you're working with them. Provide several alternative activities, so making sure that you don't just have one activity. Oh, we're just doing soccer today and we're going to hit one standard and that's it. We're just going to so making sure that you're hitting more. You have different types of soccer balls. Maybe they're bigger, maybe they're a little bit smaller, maybe some are flat. Maybe they want to do basketball that day and that's the only thing you can get them to do with a ball. So maybe you do more goalie stuff. So they want to bounce the ball, and you know that soccer goalies can bounce the ball. So maybe you have them throw the ball against the wall if that's what they want to use their hands. And say, all right, we're going to practice goalie skills now. Okay. So that way you can include, okay, if you want to use upper body, but we want to do mainly soccer, guess what? There's a goalie and they use their upper body. Maybe we're going to just do more upper body goalie stuff today. You got to just be prepared for anything. You want to provide several suggestions for facilitating interactions with peers without disabilities. So you stop or when you get breaks in the middle, just to yell out, hey, ask your buddy what their favorite exercise was from the warm up, or hey, ask your buddy what they're looking forward to most next week, or hey, ask your buddy what they're doing later this weekend. Ask your buddy how many siblings or who they live with, that type of thing. So ask them your students to interact with each other is going to provide them with social inclusion because they might not do it themselves. You might see people with disabilities and without disabilities not interacting at all. So you have to be the catalyst for their conversation. Regular versus inclusive teaching styles. So we'll talk about teaching styles, instruction, modifications, and adaptations as we go through all the series. But there's basically a regular teaching style and there's an inclusive teaching style. So the regular teaching style, they might just hit one standard for the whole class. Inclusive teaching style, they might hit multiple standards. When I teach, I tend to hit 10 standards. I could probably get 20 standards a class sometimes because of how many different things I hit, because I know there's so many different skills I need to be able to teach. I don't just teach one skill, one class. One activity, one game for all. So, all right, we're going to just play some soccer today. All right, and then you're just going to be the line judge. So no, choices and activities. Maybe you have lead up to games so that it's not just a game. So maybe more skill based, maybe more of a warm up, maybe add some dance and kickboxing, make it fun, have some low organized games that don't involve any competition but just involve fun. So focus more on that fun feature than the competition feature. It's going to save you a lot of time and headache. But you do want to have challenges like tag. You do want to have things like shark and minnows. You don't want to make it so that it's not competitive, but you do want to make sure that you're making it inclusive. Regular teaching style might just have the same equipment for everybody. Inclusive teaching style, you're going to have choices and equipment that are specific to that individual. Okay. Games use and regulation rules. So if you're a regular teacher, teaching style, you're going to use the regulation rules. If you're inclusive teaching style, you're going to modify the games depending on the individuals, depending how much space you have. You might want to make more space, less space. You might want to have more options. So like if you're playing volleyball, you're going to allow the ball to bounce. If you're playing soccer, you're going to let it go out of bounds, that type of thing. Or if it hits their hand or they use their hands, you might not give them a yellow card, that type of thing. So you're just changing the rules for the specific individuals. Respectful language. Describe the person, not the disability. So I tend to say person first language. So the individual with autism, the individual with cerebral palsy, the individual that utilizes a wheelchair. So we don't say things like wheelchair bound. We don't say things like crippled. We don't say things like suffering with autism. We don't say things like that are invoking pity or guilt for people with disabilities. We want to refer to person with disability only when it's relevant. We don't have to bring it up if it's not needed. If in doubt, people with disabilities are more than willing to help. So ask them questions. So don't be afraid to ask them a question. Um, and they will answer you, or maybe they need an interpreter, or maybe there's someone that is helping them communicate. But a lot of times they're able to communicate what they feel and how they feel. So I use WINIC, Adaptive Physical Education and Sport, for this lecture. If you're looking for resources, is a great book. WINIC is a good one. Block is a good one. Lieberman is a good one. All for adaptive physical activity and education resources. Next class, we're going to get into research in adaptive physical activity. We will talk about my research that I performed on people with disabilities for my dissertation. So I'm going to go over a literature review with you on what I found when I researched as a doctoral student. And then I'll talk to you about the program we created and how maybe you could create that program at your facility or your unified PE program. All right, everybody. I appreciate you and thank you for listening. Until next time, we'll talk adapted physical activity for lecture number 2. I'm Dr. Weber, and I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Do we have any questions on our live? Yeah, it's being yep. It'll be about to upload it now.